Chapter 1. They didn't ask me if I wanted to be given away. No one questioned whether my wolf had spoken, or if my body had ever known the touch of a bond. I was a name on a scroll, a signature beneath a crest, a daughter of lineage whose blood made her useful even if her voice never did. The moment the stone gates opened and the cold light of Vathorn spilled across my face, I knew. I wasn't being led into a union. I was being surrendered. Drake never looked at me like I was a person. I didn't feel anything at all. But there is no need for claiming when contracts were stronger than instincts. No one had ever looked at me and truly seen. But since last night, I can't stop thinking about the one who did. I don't know his name, but it seems like that encounter was fateful. It happened too fast for thought and too sharp to ignore. I rounded the corner of the eastern corridor with scrolls clutched tight to my chest, trying to disappear into utility. And instead, I stumbled on the rug, scrolls flying like brittle leaves and braced for impact that never came. Arms caught me, steady, strong, alarmingly warm through thin fabric. For a moment, all I could feel was the strange stillness in his grip, the way my body recognized his touch before my mind caught up. Then I looked up. Him, the man from the forest, the one whose presence had brushed my senses like a forgotten memory. His hand rested just below my shoulder, and his eyes, dark and unwavering, locked on mine with a focus that stole the breath from my lungs. My wolf stirred. Not a growl, not a lunge, but a shift. After weeks of silence, she moved. It felt like heat blooming under my ribs, sudden and impossible. I didn't understand it, but I knew what it meant. She was watching him. He didn't speak, didn't loosen his grip, just held me steady as if any more or any less would mean collapse. The restraint in his posture wasn't nervousness, it was precision. A silence sharp enough to cut. My heart thudded painfully. I should have stepped back, broken the moment, said anything. But I stood frozen, caught in a gravity I didn't understand. "Thank you," I managed, the words tight. He didn't answer. Not yet. And I didn't move until I had to. Only then did his hands fall away. The absence of his touch left the hallway colder. I dropped quickly, reaching for the fallen scrolls, but my hands shook. He crouched beside me wordlessly, gathered what I'd missed, and handed them over without brushing my fingers again. This time, he was careful. I looked up, but he had already turned. No words, no glance, just his back retreating into the corridor, like none of it had mattered. But something had happened, something I carried with me through every passing hour. My wolf remained quiet but present, as if now she listened not to my world but to his. Chapter 2. I stood in a dress that didn't feel like mine, with hair pinned too tightly and lips painted in a color I never chose. The mirrors had said I looked beautiful. I felt like a statue, carved for someone else's altar. The great hall of the High Keep was overflowing with wolves from every territory, alphas in ceremonial black, betas in trimmed silver, and the rest of us pressed into place like pawns waiting for commands. My pulse beat steady beneath my skin, but inside, everything twisted. I wasn't here to be honored. I was here to be displayed. Drake stood a step ahead, his expression noble, detached, the image of a generous leader presenting an offering he had shaped with care. He gestured for silence, and the room obeyed. "Tonight," he said, voice echoing through the stone chamber, "we gather not only to celebrate strength and future alliances, but to honor something rarer, mercy." His gaze slid to me, and I felt it like a chill over bare skin. This young woman, Meera Flint, was born of noble blood, but without the advantage of position. She came to us not with power, but with quiet resilience, a symbol of what the moon goddess weaves into the unseen. His hand reached for mine, not tender, not intimate, just a public gesture. I let him take it. My smile didn't reach my eyes. "In another world," he continued, "her fate might have been one of silence and shadow. But tonight, we lift her into the light, not as a possession, not as an obligation, but as an equal." The lie rang like glass cracking under frost. Every word spoken sounded graceful, even reverent, and yet beneath each syllable was the same sharp edge I had been given. Pack leaders from distant territories nodded in approval. One even raised his cup, but I could feel it, the flicker of amusement, the veiled scorn hiding behind courteous phrases. They saw me for what I was, a play made to look like a prize. I bowed my head, not in reverence, but to keep my expression from fracturing. My mother's pendant hung just beneath the neckline of my dress, hidden but close, the only thing keeping me upright, until it slipped. Somewhere in the murmur of toasts and shifting footsteps, I felt it barely a whisper of weight as the chain broke and the charm fell to the polished floor. I stiffened, glancing down, but Drake's grip on my hand tightened. "Leave it," he murmured, still smiling to the crowd. "Don't draw attention." My jaw locked. I said nothing. The pendant remained on the ground, glittering faintly between stone tiles, unnoticed by anyone else. Except me. Except my wolf. And yet I stood still, silent, perfectly posed while the only part of my family I had left lay abandoned beneath my feet. I don't remember most of what was said after that. Toasts were raised, vows exchanged between alphas like bartered favors, and I stood beside Drake like a polished token, my silence mistaken for grace. I nodded when expected, smiled when required, and let the noise of wolves pretending at civility blur into a dull roar in the back of my mind. But the ache beneath my ribs never quieted. My mother's pendant, its absence pressed against my skin harder than its weight ever had. Every step I took across that gleaming marble floor felt like betrayal. Not just of her, but of myself. And the worst part was how convincing I looked. I had trained for this kind of performance, hadn't I? A good Omega knew how to vanish without disappearing, knew how to be useful, obedient, and utterly invisible all at once. I stood still, as if nothing burned, as if my stomach didn't turn each time Drake's fingers skimmed my elbow to guide me toward another alpha to impress. They all looked at me the same way, curious, evaluating, some with false flattery, others with the sharp glint of ambition. Not one of them saw me. Not really. Not even when Drake spoke again. "This is not the end of her journey," he announced. "Tonight marks her beginning, as one among us, and as a woman of standing, free to be chosen or to choose." The words dripped with honey and poison. A murmur of approval rippled through the guests. A few smiled. I didn't, because the message was clear. I was to be presented like a choice, paraded like I had agency, only to have it twisted the moment I tried to use it. I was not free. I was curated, a ribbon tied around an invisible chain. My fingers twitched at my side, desperate for the anchor I had lost. I dared a glance down the hall toward where the pendant had fallen, but it was no longer there. Gone, trampled, forgotten, or so I thought. The evening ended with ceremony, applause, and veiled promises exchanged beneath the glint of crystal chandeliers. Drake offered me his arm as we descended the final steps of the dais. I took it, not because I wanted to, but because walking alone would have been worse. The heat of his skin through the fabric of his coat was steady, proud, cold. My wolf stirred faintly, a ripple of discomfort beneath my breastbone. She hadn't retreated completely, not this time, but she remained silent, waiting, watching. That silence followed me all the way back to my chambers, where the servants unlaced my gown and slipped away with murmured blessings. I stood alone in the dark afterward, barefoot on the cold stone floor, staring at my reflection in the tall glass panel across the room. I looked like someone else, like the girl Drake wanted the pack to see. Composed, claimed, tamed. I touched the place where my pendant had rested. My chest ached, but I didn't cry. I didn't make a sound. I simply stood still until the moon rose high enough to catch my face in the glass. That's when I felt it again, faint but sure. A warmth, a pull, and this time it wasn't inside me. It was outside, moving, close, and something inside whispered, "He saw." Chapter 3. You watched it happen. The words left my mouth before I even registered the sound of my own voice. He was already facing me by the time I reached him, standing half-shadowed near the edge of the practice yard where the ground smelled of worn leather and dust, his arms tense at his sides and his jaw locked tight. The light from the torches carved angles into his face, but his expression didn't flicker. You watched him humiliate me. You saw the way he used me, and you said nothing. My breath came sharper than I intended, and my hands curled into fists at my sides to keep them from shaking. I didn't want to tremble in front of him, not when I had stood still through worse. But this silence, this new kind of stillness, it cut deeper. "You looked at me like you knew something I didn't," I said, each word a push against the ache in my chest. "Like you understood what was happening, and then you just disappeared." He didn't speak at first, just watched me with that same unreadable steadiness, like he was weighing something too heavy for words. If I had spoken, he said finally, voice low and even, I would have done something worse. I stared at him, worse than standing there. Yes, his tone didn't shift, but something behind it did. Because I've done this before. I interfered once. It didn't end well. I swore I wouldn't do it again. The words hung between us like a line drawn in blood. So what? I'm just another mistake waiting to happen. No, he said, his voice harder now. You're not a mistake, but you're not mine to defend. That landed like a slap. Then, why are you even here? I asked, stepping closer. Why didn't you just walk away the moment you felt it, the pull, the bond, whatever it is? His jaw tensed. Because I didn't want to interfere, and I didn't want to lie. So you just let it happen, I said, unable to keep the raw edge out of my voice. You let them parade me like a possession. You let them take the last of my dignity in front of everyone. And you, my voice broke, and I hated how much that cost me. He moved then, not toward me, but to reach into his coat. His hand came back slowly, fingers curled around something small, something fragile. He opened his palm. I couldn't breathe. My pendant, the one from my mother, the one I'd worn since childhood, the one that had fallen during the engagement feast, when the lights were too bright and the voices too loud for anyone to notice a crystal hitting stone. I had told myself it didn't matter, that it was just a thing. But now, seeing it resting there in his hand, dirty, scuffed, but whole, I couldn't look away. You dropped it, he said simply. No one saw. You did, I whispered. You saw it. He nodded. I didn't speak, but I couldn't walk past it. He took a step forward and held it out. When I didn't move, he gently took my hand, placed the pendant in my palm, and closed my fingers around it. His touch lingered just long enough to burn, then fell away. Some things, he said quietly, shouldn't be left on the floor. My chest tightened. The ache I'd buried for days cracked open, not with grief, but with the unbearable weight of being seen. Really seen. Why now? I asked, voice barely above a breath. Why say anything at all? Because you came to me, he said, and because I couldn't let you think no one noticed. The space between us was no longer empty. I could feel his presence, his silence, his control, all of it pressing against something inside me that had been quietly breaking. And now, somehow, holding on. I didn't know what to do with the weight in my hand. The pendant sat curled in my fingers like something alive, radiating heat that wasn't entirely physical. My pulse thudded in my ears, and my wolf stirred again, not with urgency but with quiet attention, like she too was listening now, finally believing there might be something worth hearing. Oliver didn't move. He stood there, still and steady, as though the simple act of returning what was mine had taken more from him than he'd shown. I could feel the distance he maintained deliberate, guarded, but I could also feel the crack beneath it. It wasn't indifference. It was restraint, and that was somehow worse. You could have come to me before, I said, voice low. You could have said something before all of this spiraled into performance and politics and pretending. I know. His gaze dropped to the pendant in my hand, but every time I thought to speak, I remembered what it cost the last time I let instinct win. You keep saying that, I snapped, that you lost someone. That silence is protection, but you don't get to use ghosts as shields while the rest of us bleed. His jaw tightened. You think this doesn't cost me? I stepped closer, not out of boldness, but because the ache inside me was louder than caution. Then show me. Say what you mean, Oliver. Stop hiding behind silence and broken promises. He exhaled sharply, a breath torn from somewhere deep. What I mean is that I felt it the second I touched you. The pull, the shift. My wolf reacted before I even understood why. My breath caught. I hadn't expected him to say it out loud. Then why fight it? Because I know what happens when you give into it too fast, he said. When you forget who's watching. What's at stake? The bond doesn't protect you from the consequences. It exposes you to them. That stopped me, because I knew he was right. And still, the silence that followed felt heavier than any truth. I looked down again at the pendant. Its edges were chipped now, the chain worn thin, but the crystal still held a faint, familiar glow. I closed my fingers around it. Thank you, I said, not because I felt at peace, but because it was the only thing left to say. He nodded once, but didn't reply. We stood there for several long moments, neither of us moving, neither of us sure what came next. I thought he might step closer, that he might reach for something he didn't have words for. But he didn't. He turned, jaw clenched, and walked back toward the shadowed edge of the yard. His steps measured, his silence returned. He didn't look back. I didn't call after him. I stood rooted in place, the cool night air tightening around my arms and shoulders, the pendant pressing into my palm like a wound I hadn't let close. My wolf paced beneath my skin, more awake than before, more aware. She didn't push, she didn't speak, but she didn't retreat either. I walked back slowly, each step heavier than the last, until the walls of the keep swallowed me once more. The pendant still burned against my skin, but I didn't put it away. Not this time. I wore it into the dark like armor. Chapter 4. I left before the lights had dimmed, before the last torch in the eastern corridor could burn down to ash. My steps were too fast for caution, but too slow to be called escape. I didn't know what I was running from Drake's hand on my arm, the echo of my own silence, the memory of Oliver's fingers closing around mine, but I knew where I had to go. Somewhere dark, somewhere cold, somewhere the heat inside me couldn't follow. The moon hung low and swollen above the treetops as I passed through the outer gates, barefoot, breathless, my nightdress clinging damp to my spine. My skin burned beneath the fabric, not with fever, but with something worse, recognition. My wolf paced beneath my skin, not violently, but with a growing urgency, as though some silent command had been issued, and she no longer trusted me to ignore it. I followed the slope behind the keep, down to the place where the trees gave way to stone and water and quiet. The river that cut behind the old ruins was shallow this time of year, moonlight turning it to mercury. I dropped to my knees at the edge, the rock biting into my shins, and reached out desperate for cool, for silence, for something to quiet the growing roar inside me. The instant my fingertips met the water, I gasped. Not from cold, from pain. The water didn't freeze, it burned. A searing, mirrored heat rushed up my arm, sharp and white like lightning through flesh. I yanked my hand back, stumbling onto the stone. My palm throbbed, red and raw, but there was no wound. Only heat, pulsing beneath the surface like a mark no one could see. My wolf didn't retreat. She surged forward, fully, present, watching. It wasn't heat from within me. It was echo, answer, something someone was calling. Not with sound, but with presence. I pressed my palm flat to the stone, as if bracing against it would help. But the stone was no better. The warmth there matched the burn of the water. Element mirrored element. My breath shook. This wasn't mine alone. The air felt too charged, the wind too still. It was like the land remembered something my body hadn't spoken yet. My wolf growled low, not in fear, not in warning, in recognition. And then I felt it. Not behind me, not near, but distant, connected, like a thread being pulled from far away. Heat spiked again beneath my ribs, sudden and full, and I doubled forward, clutching my side. This wasn't illness. This wasn't panic. It was a pull, across the land, across the bond I hadn't asked for, but could no longer ignore. I wasn't alone in this heat. Someone else had felt it. Someone had answered. The space around me throbbed with invisible presence, and I knew, with absolute certainty, he was coming. Not because he should, not because he chose to, but because the bond between us had finally spoken loud enough that neither of us could stay away. I stayed at the river's edge long after the pain in my hand had faded into something quieter, more familiar, a low, pulsing heat beneath the skin, like a second heartbeat. The air around me had changed. It didn't chill as the night deepened. It thickened, like the space itself was holding its breath. I leaned forward, staring at the water that had burned me, its surface smooth as glass, reflecting nothing but darkness now. That heat, it hadn't come from me. Not really. It had responded to something, to someone. That knowledge sat low in my belly like a stone dropped into deep water, and no matter how I shifted, I couldn't shake its weight. My wolf still didn't speak, but I felt her pressed close, more fully than I had in moons. She didn't pace. She didn't push. She simply remained, as if rooted with me to the earth, both of us bracing for something we couldn't name. I pressed my palm again to the stone, expecting the sear of pain, but it had cooled. No, not cooled, shifted. The warmth remained, but it was tempered now, steadier, as though the land had accepted the imprint we'd left behind. There was something sacred in it, and terrifying, because I had no name for what was happening to me. No one had warned me what it would feel like for a bond to ignite without being claimed. No one had said the pull could feel like fire in the bones. I curled in tighter, arms wrapped around my knees, cheek resting on my sleeve. My skin was damp from sweat and dew, and every inch of me ached not from movement, but from holding so much inside for so long. My body didn't belong to me anymore. It felt like a vessel caught between signals, his and mine and hers and the moon. I thought maybe I would sleep, but sleep didn't come. Only drifting, only the quiet flicker of awareness that something inside me had crossed a threshold and could not go back. I didn't know how long I stayed like that, eyes half closed, breath shallow, heart pacing slower than before. The moon had begun its descent, and mist crept low through the trees, curling over the stones like fingers. My muscles trembled, more from exhaustion than cold, and that was when the edges began to blur. The world swayed slightly. My vision flickered. My limbs felt heavy, distant, too slow to respond. My wolf stirred sharply, alarm flashing through her like a sudden lash of wind, but my body didn't follow. It wouldn't. The heat that had once burned so hot now drained too fast, leaving my chest hollow, my breath thin. My head dropped forward, and I forced myself to rise. I needed to move, needed to get away from the water, but my knees buckled when I tried. The ground rose up too fast, too close, and just before I fully gave way, I felt it again. That brush across the bond, not touch, not words, but presence. Steady, searing, coming closer. My lips parted, but I couldn't call out. I didn't need to. The connection had already reached him. A tremor ran down my arms. Not from cold, from recognition. It felt like someone was standing behind me, even though I knew they weren't not yet. And still, I felt seen. Not by eyes, but by instinct. As though the distance between us had ceased to matter the moment I touched the water, and the land had carried that message straight to him. My last thought, before everything slipped sideways, was not fear, but knowing. I had been found. Not by accident, not by chance. He had felt it. He was coming.
Chapter 5. She was already falling when I reached her. I caught her just before her knees gave completely, slipping my hands beneath her arms, anchoring her without pulling her close. Her body was limp with heat and fatigue, her skin burning through the thin fabric of her dress like fire against my palms. I locked my stance, holding steady, refusing instinct. She sagged against me for a breath, the side of her face brushing my chest, and I nearly let go. Not because I couldn't bear her weight, but because I could. Because the moment her body leaned into mine, something ancient in me surged forward. My wolf recognized her, not with aggression, with absolute terrifying clarity. I'd known this feeling before, and I remembered what it cost. "You shouldn't be out here," I said, my voice low and measured. "You're burning." She tried to answer, but her breath came short and uneven. Her eyes opened, glazed and unfocused. I adjusted my hold just enough to keep her upright without drawing her closer. She needed to stand on her own. I needed her to. "Too much," she murmured. Inside, her voice was a scrape of sound. I had to get out. Her knees buckled again, and for a second my grip tightened. Then I forced it to ease, no closer than necessary. "Breathe," I said, and for some reason saying her name felt too intimate, too final. Her chest rose in a stuttering inhale. She didn't collapse again. She didn't cling. She just stood there, trembling, held up by the barest edge of control. And still she looked at me. "Say something," she whispered. "Please." The sound of it stopped me. I hadn't meant to stay. I hadn't meant to speak. I'd come because the fire she'd thrown into the earth had lit through the bond and ignited in me like lightning. I'd followed it because I couldn't do anything else. But this, her voice breaking, not with fear, but with need that tore something loose. "You think wolves call without reason," I said, voice quiet but steady. "You think the bond burns just because it can." She didn't blink, didn't look away, and I kept going. Mine did once. I followed it, believed in it, thought the strength of the pull meant I was meant to stay, meant to fight for it. My jaw clenched. I was wrong. I let the words settle. I let her hear what I wasn't saying, that it hadn't saved anyone, that the bond had failed. Or I had. "I lost everything," I said. She didn't speak, but something shifted in her eyes, not sympathy, understanding. Her wolf stood behind her gaze, fully present, still as mine. I hadn't felt that kind of silence in years. Not absence, not retreat, stillness, like both sides of the bond were waiting for the next breath to decide what came after. I stepped back slowly, letting her find her balance. Her legs held barely, but she stood, alone. Her voice came quiet. "So what now?" I looked at her, at the heat still rising from her skin, the edge of her strength faltering but intact. "Now we wait," I said, "until you decide if what's calling you is something you want to answer." She didn't answer me right away. She stood there, breath catching in the still air, her spine drawn tight like a bowstring barely holding. The heat around her hadn't faded, it shimmered off her skin like invisible smoke, but something in her steadied. Not completely, not safely, but enough. I kept my distance, a half step more than necessary. Her wolf was too close to the surface, and mine was no better. One wrong breath between us, and the restraint I'd fought to hold might slip. I'd felt it earlier when I caught her. That first touch had been fire wrapped in breath. But I didn't come for touch. I came because when her pain echoed through the bond, I couldn't not feel it, and I couldn't pretend it wasn't mine too. Her eyes scanned the trees behind me, then dropped to the ground, to the stones, to the space we stood in, as if looking for something solid enough to hold her. I knew that feeling too well. "I thought I was broken," she said suddenly, voice raw. "When my wolf went quiet, I thought she'd left." I didn't move. "She didn't leave," I said. "She was waiting." Meera exhaled, and that one sound held more than pain. It held shame, loneliness, fury. I was promised to a male who doesn't want me, given to a future I didn't choose. And then I touch you and everything burns like it's been waiting to wake up. Her voice rose only slightly. "Why you?" The question wasn't angry. It was desperate. I looked at her and saw the girl who had stood silent through ceremony, who hadn't screamed when the elders named her, who hadn't flinched when they called her bondless. But she wasn't empty. She was full of things no one else had bothered to see. "I don't know," I said, honest, "but I felt it too." That was the truth I hadn't meant to give, that the fire hadn't just burned her. It had hit me too, and I'd been standing in the ashes ever since. "I didn't ask for this," she whispered. "Neither did I," said. "But it came. Silence stretched between us, heavy with all the things we still wouldn't name. My wolf paced at the edge of my skin, not with impatience but pressure. She was too close. Her scent, her voice, the bond that ran like fire beneath our feet, it was all too close. I turned slightly, needing to look away. Not from her, from what I might do if I didn't. "Don't follow me," I said. "Not yet." I didn't wait for her answer. I stepped into the trees, letting the dark close around me. Each step away felt like defiance, not against her, against the part of me that had already begun to want. When I was far enough that I couldn't smell her skin or hear the trembling in her breath, I stopped. I leaned against the rough bark of a pine and let my eyes close. The pull hadn't stopped, not for a second, but for now, distance was the only tether I trusted. 13 days, that's what the council would give us. I didn't know what choice she would make. I didn't know what I'd do when she made it. But I knew this. If she called again, I wouldn't be able to ignore it.
Chapter 6. I didn't mean to end up in the West Grove, but once I stepped past the worn boundary stones and the wind shifted, I knew I wouldn't turn back. The weight in my chest hadn't eased since that night by the river, and even though I had tried to bury it under silence, the bond wouldn't go quiet. It lived inside me now, low and steady, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to me. I told myself I just needed air, distance, something beyond the scent of walls and the stares that had grown sharper since the feast. But my feet carried me too far, deeper than the perimeter the guards considered safe, into the shadow-thick wild between the western ridge and the broken circle of old stones where no patrols passed anymore. The moment I crossed beneath the arching limbs of the elder oaks, I felt the change. Not danger, not chill, something slower pressure in the stillness, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The silence wasn't empty. It was listening. I almost turned back. Almost, but then I saw it. A shape in the moss, too clean to be natural. I crouched, heart tight, and looked closer. A paw print, deep, even, unmistakable. No claw marks, no panic in the way it sank. An alpha's step. My pulse stumbled. I scanned the trail and found another. Then another. Wide set, intentional, spaced just enough to read as movement, not a chase. Someone had been walking, not hunting, not fleeing, moving through this place as if it belonged to him. I didn't need scent to know. My wolf stirred with certainty I couldn't argue. It was him. Oliver had come this way, more than once, and not to confront, to observe. I stood slowly, following the curve of tracks through the undergrowth, each one a quiet confession. Bark was rubbed clean where a shoulder had passed. Ferns bent gently, not crushed. The trail was recent, less than a day. He'd been here while I slept, while I thought the bond had stilled. My hand drifted unconsciously to the place where my pendant now rested, tucked safely beneath my collarbone. I had spent so long believing no one was watching, that even when I burned, I was alone in it. But he had walked here, quietly, carefully, like it mattered that I never noticed. Like his presence wasn't meant to frighten but to shield. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know if it scared me more than it steadied me. I just kept walking, breath caught in my throat, until the trail stopped at a clearing I recognized but had never named. The trees curved inward here, their branches overlapping like a woven canopy, and the ground bore no new tracks. Just the imprint of his last step deeper than the others, the soil still slightly warm. He'd stood here, still, watching, and left nothing behind but silence. I dropped to my knees and pressed my palm against the earth, expecting nothing. But the bond answered. Faint, not pulling, not speaking, just present, like it had been here long before I noticed it. And suddenly, I wondered how many times I had passed close to him without knowing. How many times I had felt eyes and called it instinct. How many nights he had been near enough to hear me breathe, yet chose the darkness over revelation. Not from fear, from control, from guilt, or something older. I closed my eyes and leaned forward, letting my forehead touch the place he had stood. There was no voice, no echo, just pressure and presence, and something vast beneath it all that felt too much like fate to name. I stayed crouched in that place far longer than I meant to, forehead against the earth, hand braced where his last step had settled. It wasn't about the shape of the track anymore. It wasn't even about proof. It was about the quiet that clung to this clearing like memory. I didn't need to see him to know he'd stood here more than once. The soil knew him. The trees held the hush of his restraint. And my wolf pressed forward with the kind of patience I had never known from her, as if she'd known all along and only now allowed me to understand. She didn't question the prints. She accepted them, like this path had always been ours to find, even if only one of us was walking it. When I finally stood, my legs ached with the weight of stillness, but my steps came easier. I followed nothing now, just the sense of where he might have gone, the tension in the air that hadn't lifted. A bird called once overhead, then quieted. A twig cracked, not from weight, but from memory. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, like it knew something had been broken open here and wasn't ready to let it close. I moved to the edge of the clearing and turned in a slow circle, eyes scanning the dark curve of trees, the underbrush, the shape of places a wolf could hide. He wasn't here now. Of that I was sure, but he had been. And that truth opened 1,000 more questions I wasn't ready to ask. Why this place? Why so often? Why never closer? Maybe I already knew. Maybe, like me, he couldn't look directly at the bond without burning. But unlike me, he'd found a way to live just close enough to feel it and just far enough not to drown. My fingers brushed over my pendant. I didn't unclasp it, didn't pull it into view. I only touched it as a tether, grounding myself to something I had carried before him. Before this, and then I turned to leave. But as I took my first step back toward the ridge, I noticed something beside a low rock at the edge of the tree line. Another track, but this one older, softer, not from last night. Maybe a week, maybe more. And beside it, faint, nearly erased by time and moss, a second set. Smaller, lighter. I stared. Not mine, not his, but someone had been here before both of us. Or with him. The realization coiled cold in my stomach. He hadn't always come here alone. That fact settled like a stone in my throat. I wasn't sure why it hurt, only that it did. And my wolf didn't growl. She simply watched. We turned away. The walk back was longer than it had been coming in, though I didn't stray from the path. My thoughts wandered ahead, chasing the idea that maybe the bond wasn't just about what will be, but what already was. That maybe I hadn't imagined the shadow in the ruins weeks ago. Maybe the feeling of being seen in the courtyard hadn't been grief or heat or fear. Maybe it had been him, always just far enough away not to touch, always too close to forget. When the keep's high walls finally came back into view, I paused at the edge of the clearing and glanced back. There was no one behind me, only the stillness of trees and the hum of something that wouldn't stop pulsing just beneath the surface of my skin. I exhaled slowly. The path behind me wasn't erased. It had been waiting. Chapter 7. Drake never moved in chaos. He waited for stillness, for vulnerability dressed as peace. I should have known he would come to me when the air finally felt calm again. That morning the keep was quiet, the kitchens silent, the courtyards washed in early mist, and I stood alone at the east colonnade, hands braced on the stone rail, staring past the fog like it might hold answers I didn't have. My wolf was quiet, too, not retreating, not dormant, just watching, waiting. She didn't stir when I heard footsteps, slow and measured, approach from behind. She didn't growl, but she didn't move forward either. "You've been avoiding me," Drake said, his voice low, warm, as if we were friends sharing a conversation and not a history carved in strategy. I didn't answer. There was no point. I had avoided him. That was true, and he had given me space, but not because he respected it, because he'd been calculating the moment to return. I turned slowly, meeting his gaze without stepping back. He looked rested, as always, dressed not in alpha black but in slate blue, a color that softened his shoulders, made his approach seem less like a power play and more like a suggestion. He smiled faintly. I didn't return it. "I wanted to let you breathe," he continued. "I know everything's been," he gestured vaguely, "a lot. You call what you did at the feast a lot." I asked. My voice didn't rise. "I call it what it was. A spectacle." He tilted his head, unbothered. "It was a gesture of generosity. You didn't want to be claimed, so I offered you the illusion of choice. And now, I offer something real." That word turned in my chest like a key in a lock I didn't want to open. He stepped closer, still not touching, but close enough that I could feel the precision of his posture, always appearing casual, but never anything less than designed. "I'm not here to trap you, Meera," he said. "In fact, I'm here to offer you freedom. Your version of it," I said, "which comes with strings." "No strings," he said smoothly. "Just clarity. You don't want the bond. Fine. You don't want to be chosen, so choose." I stepped back. "You walk forward with name, title, protection. As my mate in status, but not in spirit." I stared at him. "No claiming," he added. "No heat, no touch, just alliance. You keep your strength. I keep my word. And the council sees a united front." It sounded polished, even reasonable, the kind of deal an alpha made when he wanted to look magnanimous without losing control. But every word slid against my skin like cold iron. "Why?" I asked. "Why offer this now?" His gaze didn't shift. "Because I see you. Because I know what happens next if you don't accept. You walk forward alone and someone else loses." My pulse skipped. "Oliver," he didn't nod. He didn't need to. I saw it in the slight change of his stance. The warning wasn't veiled. It was dressed in courtesy, but it was real. 13 days, he said. The council will ask you to decide. I'm giving you a way to end it early. On your terms. But not mine, I said. Yours. He smiled again, the kind that looked almost gentle. It's not about winning, Meera. It's about protecting what matters. His tone was soft, but the cold underneath, it curled around my spine like smoke. He didn't want me. He wanted my choice to break. I should have turned away then. I should have stepped back, said no, walked past him without offering another breath of my silence. But I didn't move. Not because I was tempted, and not because I believed him. I stood still because for the first time I saw it for what it was, this offer. This polished mercy. It wasn't generosity. It was strategy. Drake wasn't giving me freedom. He was giving me a cage with velvet walls. You've thought this through, I said quietly. You always do. Of course, he replied, tone smooth. This isn't a decision to take lightly. You deserve more than shame and silence. You deserve recognition. Without a bond, I said. Without the one thing that might actually choose for me. The bond is unpredictable, he said. Dangerous, even. You've already seen what it's doing to you. My chest tightened. He wasn't wrong about the heat, about the strain. But that wasn't his concern, it never had been. That's not what you're afraid of, I said. You're not offering this to protect me. You're doing it because you can't control him. His expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Oliver is unstable, he said. He's reckless. You don't know what he's done, what he's capable of. You think the bond will save you, but it might ruin you. You mean it might ruin you, I said. Because if I choose him, I don't just reject your plan, I expose it. No, Drake said calmly. If you choose him, you take the entire pack into uncertainty. You invite scrutiny, questions. You ignite a storm that won't protect anyone. Then let it burn, I whispered. He took a step closer. You can't afford that, Meera. You want to stand on your own. I get it. But do it wisely. Do it without lighting matches you can't control. I looked at him then, really looked. At the calm surface, the graceful posture, the voice that never rose and the gaze that never flinched. He'd wrapped poison in silk. And now he wanted me to drink it, thank him for it, and believe I was free. You want me to say yes, so it looks like I came willingly, I said. You want me to wear the choice like armor, so no one sees the bruise underneath. I want you to survive, he said, softly. That's all I've ever wanted. No, I said. You want me silent, beautiful, useful, yours but only on paper. He didn't argue. He didn't need to. His silence confirmed what I already knew. I stepped back just once, enough to breathe. I'll answer when the council asks, I said. Not before. And if I rescind the offer by then I guess we both lose, I replied. My wolf stirred at that, low and sharp, as if to say, not both, not all, not yet. He studied me for a long second, as if measuring what was left of me to manipulate. Then he gave a small nod, respectful, almost fond. You know where to find me, he said. And then he left. I didn't watch him go. I didn't need to. I turned back to the stone railing, gripping it tighter this time, and stared out into the fog not for answers, but for quiet. The echo of his voice still clung to my skin, but beneath it, something older pulsed. Not pressure, a real choice. Not yet claimed, but mine.
Chapter 8. The room held the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful, it was waiting to break. I stood at the edge of the chamber, just inside the stone arch, arms loose at my sides, every part of me still. The council had already gathered, each elder in place, backs straight, voices recently used and now withheld. Drake stood in the center as though the room had been built around him, spine like steel beneath his slate-gray coat, expression polished to a fault. His voice had filled the hall minutes before I arrived, echoing down the curved stone walls like honeyed command, calm, certain, offering Meera as much as she was allowed to choose. I knew his tone. I'd heard it before when he made threats sound like invitations. I didn't look at him. I looked at her. Meera stood to the side of the circle, not facing anyone, not turning her back. She had placed herself outside of the center, and yet somehow she drew the weight of the room more than he did. Her hands were clasped in front of her, knuckles white, but her stance was anchored. She looked small. She didn't feel small. The bond between us hadn't spoken since the night in the forest, but it hummed now low, alive, warning. Her wolf was awake, not pacing, not rising, held. The elder at the center lifted her hand. If the proposal stands unopposed, she said, we will recognize the arrangement as binding and enter it into formal record. The words were spoken as though they'd already been carved into stone. The Omega will receive full standing under Alpha. Drake grinned. No bond required. Binding, without instinct, without choice. I waited. Meera didn't speak, but her shoulders tensed just slightly, breath catching. That's when I felt it, like the air dipped. A pull not toward me but through me. I took one step forward. I said nothing, just moved enough for her to feel that I was there, that she wasn't alone. Drake didn't turn his head, but his jaw locked. He knew. If there are no objections, the elder began again, tone harder now. And then it happened. No words, no declaration, just sound, raw, unyielding, ancient. A single note dragged from somewhere far older than this room, far older than any ceremony. It came from Meera's chest, not spoken, not forced, a sound pulled from the earth itself. The first vibration was low, more felt than heard. The second was undeniable. A howl, not human, not broken. A sound no trained Omega should have been able to make. Not in this chamber, not in front of this council. But she did. Her voice shattered the stillness like thunder through standing stone. The walls didn't echo. They absorbed. The silence afterward wasn't recovery. It was shock. I didn't move. No one did. Even the elder nearest her lowered her hand without realizing it. Meera didn't fall, didn't stumble. She stood, chest heaving, lips parted, eyes unfocused but blazing. Her wolf had answered. Drake stared like he didn't recognize her, like he couldn't understand how the girl he'd dressed in obedience could carry a sound that shook the bones of the pack. I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on her. And then I spoke. "You thought she was empty," I said, voice even. "You thought silence meant submission." I took another step forward, slow. But silence like hers means something else. It means depth. It means danger. And it means you weren't listening. Meera's fingers trembled once, then stilled. She didn't look at me. She didn't need to. Every wolf in that room had just felt what she was. The kind of howl that doesn't beg for place. The kind that claims it. The echo of her howl hadn't fully faded, but already the air in the chamber felt different, denser, charged, as though the foundations of the council's control had cracked just enough to let something older bleed through. No one spoke. For once, even the elders looked unsure whether to resume their script or pretend they hadn't just heard what every wolf in the room would remember for the rest of their lives. I stayed still. Meera hadn't moved since the sound left her. Her chest still rose and fell like her lungs couldn't catch up to what her body had done, but she hadn't recoiled. She didn't look shocked. She looked present, grounded, and dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with dominance or position. Drake finally shifted. His stance tightened, not dramatically, but enough for those watching him closely to see it. He masked it in a half step forward, then turned to the elders with a graciousness that rang too sweet. "The Omega is understandably overwhelmed," he said, his voice smoother than before, almost apologetic. "This moment is emotional. We should give her space to regain herself." Coward, that's what it was, wrapped in diplomacy, sealed in charm. A retreat disguised as concern. Meera's head turned slightly at his words, and her jaw set with an edge I hadn't seen on her face until now. A boundary, a decision being born. She didn't speak. The council stirred, whispering low, their carefully managed ritual spiraling off course. The elder in the center looked between Meera, Drake, then me, as if trying to find the right line to retreat to. "The bond," someone said, soft, skeptical. "Perhaps it's deeper than we understood. Perhaps it was never absent," I said, stepping forward fully now. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Perhaps we were simply too invested in her silence to hear it breathing. Meera turned her head slightly, just enough that her gaze met mine. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't relief. It was recognition, not of me, but of what had finally been allowed to rise in her without shame. Her wolf had taken space in the room, and she had not been punished for it. That mattered more than anyone understood. The elder cleared her throat. "In light of this manifestation, the council will recess to consider the terms of Alpha Drake's proposal. No decision will be entered today." Drake inclined his head as if this had been his idea. I didn't move. Meera didn't either. The silence between us was no longer strained, it was connected, stretched thin like a cord neither of us wanted to tug, but neither of us could ignore. I could still feel her wolf brushing mine across the bond, not demanding, not clinging. Just there, the presence that had once flickered like a candle now glowed like a coal. Constant, quiet, impossible to put out. When the chamber slowly emptied, the elders murmuring behind shut lips, Meera remained where she was. Drake passed her without speaking. I watched his shoulder tense as he moved by her, watched his eyes flick to mine just for a second before he was gone. He would not forget this, but more than that, he would not forgive it. And I didn't care. When the door closed behind the last of them, she still hadn't spoken. I took one breath, then another. She turned her head and said nothing. That was enough. There would be time for words later. For now, the silence between us was not a void. It was a promise.
Chapter 9. I stood near the broken arch on the southern edge of the keep, the one no one used anymore, staring out at the barren hills as if they could offer clarity, when the space beside me shifted. "You're not easy to catch alone," he said softly. His voice didn't startle me, but it struck differently than usual. No silk, no ice, just smooth, empty space between syllables. I didn't turn. "Maybe I'm not meant to be caught." "Not caught," he corrected. "Heard." That made me look. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't distant either. His stance was open, arms loose, shoulders relaxed like we were two wolves with nothing at stake. That should have been the first warning. Drake didn't approach empty-handed. He brought strategy in every breath. "You have time still," he said, watching my face. 13 days, that's what they said. "But you don't have to wait." "Is that what this is?" I asked, voice low. "A countdown. A last invitation," he replied. "I'm not here to convince. I'm here to offer you peace before the storm finishes building." "You mean the choice?" "I mean the aftermath of it." He stepped closer, only a fraction, and the warmth of the sun didn't reach the space between us. "You think you're choosing between two paths, but one of them doesn't lead where you believe it does." I held his gaze. "And you've seen the future now. I've seen enough to know that Oliver won't save you from the cost of being chosen. He hasn't asked to be chosen." "Exactly," Drake said, too smoothly. "And yet, you've already begun answering him." My throat tightened, not with guilt, but with something heavier. The bond had burned through every defense I'd laid between instinct and logic, and Drake had noticed. "You don't care who I choose," I said. "You care that it wasn't you." "No," he said. "I care that you don't understand what he's hiding." I blinked. "What are you talking about?" "Your ideal," he said, tone still even. "The quiet alpha who watches instead of speaks, who burns instead of binds, who disappears instead of takes. You think that's strength. It isn't. It's concealment. You don't know him, Meera. Not the way I do. You don't know what he's fought to stay silent about." "No," he said, "but I know what happens when silence cracks." There was something in his eyes then that didn't match his voice, something that made the hair on my arms lift. "If I walk away," I asked slowly, "what happens next?" He tilted his head. "Then I do nothing." And I let the truth rise like it always does. I stared at him, heart ticking faster now. "You're threatening him." "No," he said calmly. "I'm offering you a final warning. Before you make a choice you can't take back." "Why now?" "Because there are things even you wouldn't forgive if you knew them. And I think you deserve the chance to decide before someone else decides for you." I felt my breath falter, not from belief, from fear, not of Drake, of what I might find if I asked the wrong question, or the right one. He stepped back then, as if to say the conversation was finished. "I won't bring this up again," he said, "but if the council asks tomorrow, know that peace is still on the table. For you, and for him, but only if you take it before it burns." And then he left. No dramatics, no final glance, just a steady retreat into silence. I didn't follow. I stood in place, pulse racing, and for the first time in days, my wolf stepped back not with distance, with hesitation. I stayed by the broken arch long after he disappeared. The silence felt different now, thicker, not with threat, but with weight. Every part of me still burned from the encounter, not because his words had landed like blows, but because they had landed at all. Drake hadn't spoken like a rival. He had spoken like someone who already knew how the story would end. And I hated that part of me didn't doubt him. My wolf paced beneath my skin, no longer steady, no longer silent. She wasn't running. She was circling, like something had shifted under her paws, and she hadn't yet decided whether it was solid or dangerous. I pressed my hands to the railing and tried to breathe through it, through the threat he hadn't quite spoken, and the question he had planted like a seed I didn't ask for. What is he hiding? The words wouldn't leave me. I wanted to dismiss them. I wanted to believe there was nothing more to Oliver than what he gave me: stillness, strength, silence so measured it felt like stone. But stone could crack. Silence could cover rot. I shook my head and stepped away from the wall, moving without thinking, following the eastern hall until the shadows changed and the scent of cedar reached me before I turned the corner. His scent, faint, not recent, but it curled around the corridor like a memory that refused to fade. I should have gone back to my quarters. I should have pushed the doubt away, let it die in silence like Drake wanted. But I didn't. I let it live. I let it breathe. Not because I believed Drake, but because some part of me needed to know. And that part was louder now than my fear. When I reached the training yard, empty and half-lit by the afternoon haze, I stopped at the threshold. The stillness of the place didn't comfort me. It reminded me of the way Oliver stood always waiting, always watching. I remembered what Drake said. You don't know what he's fought to stay silent about. I wanted to shout that it didn't matter, that what Oliver had given me, his restraint, his patience, the space he let me fill on my own, was worth more than Drake's polished threats. But if there was truth buried beneath all that silence, I deserved to see it. I turned and left the yard, not sure where I was going. My wolf didn't guide me. She walked beside me, unsettled but not resisting. We weren't in danger. We were in hesitation. And that, somehow, was worse. By the time I reached the old eastern garden, the sun had dropped lower. My fingers brushed over the ivy-wrapped stones, the ones I'd hidden behind when I needed to breathe, back when I thought I was the only one who heard the silence between us. Now I wasn't sure. Had he been hiding something, or protecting it? Was his silence mercy or armor? And if Drake's threat was real, if whatever Oliver had buried truly could burn us both, what would I choose when the time came? Would I still reach for the fire? Or would I let it consume itself and walk away before the ash touched my name? I didn't know. Not yet. But I felt the clock moving inside me. Every second closer to the ritual. Every heartbeat louder. The council would ask soon. The moment I named him, the past wouldn't stay buried. That was what Drake had said. And though I hated the way he said it, I couldn't pretend the warning hadn't cut through. I lowered myself onto the garden bench, the stones still warm beneath me, and stared at the sky as the light began to shift. My wolf sat at the edge of my thoughts, ears forward, still. She didn't offer answers. She didn't ask questions. She waited for truth, or for the lie to fall apart. Chapter 10. I came here on my own. No messenger. No order. Just a quiet understanding that when the moon reaches a certain point in its cycle, some doors open whether you knock or not. The house was old, tucked behind the eastern ridge, hidden between two leaning pines and a crooked stream no one mapped anymore. I didn't know if I was welcome, but I knew I wouldn't be turned away. The air shifted the moment I stepped inside. Not colder, not darker, just older. Like memory lived here in layers. Like silence didn't just fall, it watched. The first to greet me was Aurea Brent. Her presence filled the room before her voice did, tall and quiet, with eyes that had seen too many seasons to blink at a trembling girl. She didn't offer comfort. She offered space. That alone was enough to disarm me. "Sit," she said simply, and I did. The room was warm with herbs and fire, not sharp, but lived in. There were no questions, no rituals, just 3 chairs, 3 women, and me. Thalia Brent entered next. Her energy moved like wind before storm contained, charged. Her gaze swept over me like a ledger being updated. She didn't judge. She calculated. "She's smaller than I thought," Thalia said to no one in particular. "But not hollow. She isn't here to impress you," Aurea replied, not unkindly. "She's here because something inside her isn't settled yet." The third arrived last. Varia Brent walked like the room belonged to her soul, not her hands. She smiled at me, not kindly, not cruelly, just directly. "You waited too long," she said. "But that's the only way some of us learn." I didn't ask what they meant. I didn't speak at all. Words felt too sharp here, too new. It was Varia who broke the stillness again. "You'll be asked soon," she said. "Which one?" I nodded. "And you've already been told the costs." Another nod. "Then we won't speak of men," she said. "Only of choosing." That word throbbed in my chest like a bruise. Choosing. I hadn't done much of that in my life. Not openly. Not for myself. I sat straighter, unsure if I was ready to hear what came next, but knowing I wouldn't leave without it. Aurea leaned forward, hands folded over her knees. "Choose the one who won't let you die," she said. Her voice wasn't dramatic. It was tired, worn from grief that had settled into her bones long ago. "Not just your body. The one who won't let the part of you that matters vanish. The one who will hold your voice when you forget how to use it." I didn't breathe for a second. I didn't need to. She had already seen the shape of my fear. Thalia spoke next. "Choose the one the pack will follow," she said. "The one whose name will protect you when yours is under fire. You think strength is in standing alone. It isn't. It's in knowing when your survival depends on being part of something bigger." Her eyes were steady, unyielding. I didn't hate her for it. I just didn't know if I could believe in a future shaped by other people's acceptance. And then Varia, the oldest, the sharpest, the wildest. She leaned back, hands loose in her lap, and said nothing at first. Just watched. "Then, and you?" She asked. "When was the last time you chose something just for you?" Her question didn't stab. It slipped beneath the ribs, quiet and precise. "Not what your wolf wants. Not what your name needs. Not what the council thinks is tolerable." Her voice was softer now, but no less direct. "What do you want, Meera Flint?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. Not yet. My throat felt too small for truth. The fire cracked once, and no one pushed. No one filled the silence after Varia's question. It hovered in the air like ash from a dying flame, not dangerous, just inescapable. The room didn't press, but it didn't release me either. I felt the weight of their lives sitting around me, not in judgment, but as proof of loss, of endurance, of what remained after the world stopped trying to tell them who to be. My hands had curled into my lap without realizing. I stared at my knuckles, then at the faint line where my mother's pendant used to rest, before I hid it again beneath my collar. I wanted to ask them how they had known, not who to choose, but how. How to move when the ground beneath you shifts with every heartbeat. How to speak when your voice still carries the shape of other people's expectations. But they didn't offer those answers. They didn't fill the room with parables or warnings. They simply existed as versions of what I could become, depending on what I chose to hold or release. Aurea was strength wrapped in stillness, the echo of something precious that had once been hers and was no longer. Her loss didn't make her weak. It gave her depth. And when she looked at me, she didn't ask for understanding, only recognition. Choose the one who won't let you die. Thalia was power wrapped in clarity. She hadn't lost herself. She had given parts away for the safety of many. And though her words had felt like rules, I realized now that they were also shields. She had lived long enough to know what happened when the pack turned cold. Choose the one the pack will follow. And Varia, she had nothing to prove. Her eyes held no agenda, just memory. Her exile had shaped her, not ruined her. She had broken tradition and bled for it, but she hadn't apologized. When was the last time you chose something just for you? My chest tightened, not from fear, from truth. For the first time since the bond began whispering through my blood, I felt something break loose, not my wolf, not my certainty, my permission. I didn't speak it aloud. I didn't need to. Varia's eyes narrowed just slightly, as if she'd seen it pass through me before I had. Good, she said quietly. Now leave before this place starts feeling too safe. I rose without a word, not because I didn't want to speak, but because silence, in this house, meant more than explanation. Aurea touched my wrist gently as I passed. The voice will come, she said. Let it sound like yours. I nodded once. At the door, Thalia didn't stop me, but her gaze followed me with weight. The pack will not understand your fire, she said, but they will follow its heat. Outside, the light had shifted again. The shadows weren't shorter. They were sharper, more defined. I walked away from the house and didn't look back. My wolf moved quietly at my side, not ahead, not behind. Equal, and for the first time since they dragged me into the middle of this war disguised as ceremony, I understood what they had given me. Not guidance, not reassurance. They had given me a mirror. And when I stood before it, I didn't see fear anymore. I saw a girl with ash on her breath and fire in her spine. I saw someone who would not be told what she was worth. Not by the council, not by her heat, not even by the bond. When the time came, I would choose, and I would not ask to be forgiven for it. Chapter 11. The courtyard had never been this quiet, not even during final bond rites or council proclamations. The air itself felt suspended, held between breath and memory, as if the land knew something irreversible was about to take place. Wolves from every edge of the keep stood shoulder to shoulder, not packed, not tense, just waiting. Their eyes weren't on the elders. They were on me. At the center of the stone ring, my heart beat like it was trying to split me open from the inside, but my face didn't shift. I had trained for stillness in much harder rooms than this. I stood alone, no hand to hold, no voice to guide, no wolf to anchor me. Just the echo of 3 truths still ringing in my blood. Don't die, don't yield, and for once, don't forget yourself. The council began the call, the traditional recitation carved in cadence, each line weighed down by the burden of history. I barely heard them. My body was there, yes, but my mind was somewhere else, watching the way the shadow moved on the flagstone, how the wind kept circling the northern arch but never crossed the center line, how I could feel the heat of him somewhere just beyond the ring. I didn't turn to look. Not yet. The elder raised her voice, the final question unfolding in the air like a blade. You stand unclaimed, unbound, unbroken. You carry the right of naming. Will you invoke it now? I didn't hesitate. I will. The silence that followed was a living thing. My name hadn't been called. His had to be spoken first. I looked ahead, past the weight of the council, past the tension building at the edge of the crowd. I choose. The breath caught in my throat, not from fear, but from the realization that once spoken, there was no return. Oliver Vance. It didn't echo. It didn't need to. His name settled over the courtyard like dusk, inevitable, quiet, permanent. A low murmur swept through the wolves behind the line, some startled, some expectant. I didn't turn to see their faces. I only looked forward until I heard the shift. A single step, then another, slow, even, and then he appeared. He didn't wear alpha colors. He didn't dress for spectacle. His eyes didn't scan the crowd or search for approval. He looked only at me. And when he reached the circle's edge, he crossed it without flinching. Every law said he had to wait for the final sanction. But the bond had rewritten the law. The elders said nothing. The crowd held their breath. He stopped in front of me, close, closer than he'd ever stood with eyes on us. His gaze didn't demand. It confirmed. I didn't move. My heart didn't race. It steadied, as if it had finally found the rhythm it had been missing. "Meera," he said. My name in his voice wasn't a question. It wasn't a command. It was a promise. I didn't realize I was shaking until his hand reached out, not to grab, not to mark, but to take mine gently. Fingers warm, steady, deliberate. And then, without ceremony, without spectacle, he bent his head and pressed his lips to the back of my hand. The sound in the courtyard was no longer silence. It was reverence, not for him, not for me, but for the choice made without force, the one that had grown not from heat, not from law, but from something no one had seen coming. His lips left my skin, but the weight of the moment didn't lift. If anything, it deepened. I could feel the eyes behind me shifting, calculating, some burning with approval, others masked with unease, but I didn't turn to read them. I didn't need a witness to tell me what I already felt. The bond between us hadn't burst open like a flood or a flame. It had unfolded slowly, like heat rising through old stone, quiet and enduring. He didn't speak again, and I was glad. His silence now was no longer armor. It was presence. I watched him straighten, his hand still lightly around mine. And then, as if on cue, the elder cleared her throat. "The name has been spoken," she said, her voice carefully level. "The choice is heard." A pause. Then, "Do any stand in formal challenge?" The question rang across the stone like an invitation no one wanted to touch. For a breath, there was nothing. Then Drake stepped forward, not into the circle, just one pace beyond the inner line. His expression was perfectly neutral. Not anger, not defeat, but calculation. The kind that said the game wasn't over, only paused. He inclined his head not to me, not to the council, but to Oliver. A nod that carried no respect, only patience. "You won today. I'm still here tomorrow." Then he turned and stepped back into the crowd, the line closing behind him without a sound. The elder raised her hand again, and the remaining rites began. Words about alignment and balance, oaths of peace and preservation. I heard none of it. My wolf had pressed so close to me now, I felt her in every joint. She didn't pace. She didn't push. She simply waited, breath to breathe, as if finally allowed to stand in light that didn't burn. When the rite closed, and the lines of the crowd began to loosen, no one came forward. No well-wishers. No questions. Only stillness, and the faint sound of footfalls fading as wolves dispersed. I thought it might feel like triumph. It didn't. It felt like the moment before a storm hits, when the wind drops and the pressure rises and your skin knows something is coming, even if your mind can't name it. I turned to Oliver, ready to speak, but he shook his head gently. "Not yet," he said, just loud enough for me to hear. "Keep it yours a little longer." I swallowed the words I hadn't formed yet and nodded. He released my hand, but only after a beat of hesitation, like his body hadn't quite caught up to the fact that the ceremony was over. We walked together across the circle, not touching, not speaking, but aligned. When we reached the edge, he let me step forward first, not as a gesture, as instinct. And as I passed beyond the last row of stone, I let myself breathe again. My pulse had steadied, but my thoughts hadn't, because even now, especially now, Drake's words still lingered like smoke at the edge of something clean. "You don't know what he's hiding." I didn't want to believe him, but belief had never been enough. I had chosen, and in doing so, I had opened a door that could no longer be closed. For now, there was still quiet between us, but it was the kind that trembled, the kind that knew too much waited just beneath its skin.
Chapter 12. She didn't see me right away. Or maybe she did and chose not to react. Meera walked through the flickering shadows of the upper terrace with a kind of stillness that didn't beg for notice but refused to be overlooked. The crowd parted for her without knowing why, sensing that something in her had shifted, even if they couldn't name it. I didn't approach immediately. I waited until the music began, a cautious melody drawn out in low strings and half-held breath, unsure whether it was meant for celebration or for mourning. The wolves surrounding the courtyard hadn't moved. They watched us, yes, but none of them had stepped forward. The ritual had ended, but the pack didn't know how to follow what didn't follow rules. Meera had spoken her choice out loud. and I had answered it, but no one knew what came after. I crossed the stone toward her with measured steps, not forcing presence, only making it undeniable. She stood near one of the torches, her face still lit with the echo of ceremony, and when I stopped beside her, I didn't reach for her. I didn't speak until she turned to me, and even then, my voice stayed low. "There's music," I said, "and they're waiting for a reason not to leave." Her eyes met mine, cool but open. "Do you want to give them one?" "No," I said, "but I think you should." She arched a brow, not unkindly. "You think I owe them a show? I think you deserve to be seen for who you are now." That paused her. Her fingers, which had curled loosely at her sides, lifted slightly. I didn't take them until she placed them into mine, and then we moved, slow and steady, toward the center of the stone clearing. The courtyard held its breath. The music shifted, sensing something in our pace. I didn't lead. I matched. My hand slid gently to her back, resting high enough to guide without claiming. The other held hers firmly, but never with pressure. She stepped into the first movement without waiting, and I adjusted without pause. Her wolf was close, I could feel it, steady under her skin like heat in a blade, but it didn't press. She let the rhythm carry us, not perfectly, not gracefully, but like it mattered. I didn't think about the wolves watching. I didn't think about the elders or the council or Drake standing somewhere beyond the firelight, watching with that silent calculation he always wore like armor. I thought only of her, of how she had once stood before this pack, as a pawn wrapped in courtesy, and how she now stood beside me by no one's permission but her own. The music rose slightly, strings weaving into something more fluid. She turned beneath my arm with a motion so simple it nearly broke me, not because of the step, because of the trust it took to take it. When she met my gaze again, I didn't smile. I didn't need to. I let her see that I would not use her name as shield or weapon, that I would carry it like the only truth I hadn't ruined. And when the final note hung in the air, quiet and suspended, I didn't let go immediately. We stayed still for one breath longer than we should have, and the pack didn't move. For once, no one questioned what they saw. When I finally released her hand, I did it slowly, deliberately, not to linger but to mark the difference between claiming someone and choosing to stand with them. We stepped back from the firelight together, without a bow, without fanfare. There had never been a victory here, only something stronger than winning. She had not asked to be led. She had allowed herself to be seen, and I would not dishonor that by looking away. As we stepped out of the firelight and back into the edge of the crowd, no one stopped us. They parted around her without touch, without questions, watching the space we created simply by standing side by side. I felt their eyes on me, but I didn't respond to them. I kept my focus on Meera, her breath still a little uneven, her chin lifted in that way that wasn't defiance but endurance. She wasn't trembling, though I knew she was still bracing for something, judgment maybe, or another turn of pressure from someone waiting to corner her again. But no one came. Drake had vanished from sight. The elders said nothing. The pack remained still. For the first time since the council had bound her name to politics, Meera Flint stood in front of them and wasn't treated like an offering. She was a presence now, a will, and I let her take that space in silence. We didn't speak as we crossed the terrace toward the far edge, where the lights gave way to open sky, and the night wind moved through the trees like it had been waiting for us. She stopped there, just beyond the last stone marker, and I followed without a word. Her arms crossed over her chest, not defensive, but gathering, holding something close. I could feel the edge of what she wanted to ask. But she didn't speak, and I didn't force it. I stood beside her, close enough for our shoulders to nearly touch, and let the silence stretch. It wasn't the strained quiet from before, the kind built of secrets and fear. It was a silence that held weight, one that asked for nothing but permission to exist. "They're not going to forget that," she said eventually, her voice low and without embellishment. "Good," I said. "They weren't meant to." She nodded once, still looking ahead, the curve of her jaw sharp in the moonlight. "You didn't ask," she said. "Before, after, during, you didn't try to claim what I hadn't offered. That wasn't mine to take." Her throat moved with a slow swallow, and I saw the tension begin to shift in her spine, not leaving, but loosening. "I don't know what comes next," she admitted. "Neither do I replied. "But I'll stand with you in it." I saw her glance at me then, not fully turning but enough to meet my eyes. There wasn't softness in her gaze. There was something better, clarity, and maybe even a little trust. "You said once your bond answered, and you lost everything." "I did. Do you regret it?" I didn't answer immediately. I let the question settle into the air between us and tried to find truth inside the instinct to protect. "No," I said finally, "but I learned how much pain silence can cover, and how much damage pretending not to feel can do." She nodded slowly. "Then maybe this time we don't pretend." I didn't smile, but I breathed more fully than I had in days. "All right." Her fingers brushed the edge of her sleeve, nervous and steady all at once, and I knew we were both standing in something fragile. Not safety, not yet, but possibility. A future neither of us had asked for, but one we might be strong enough to shape. Behind us, the music began again, softer this time, but we didn't turn back. Not yet. She stood beside me without moving, and I stayed rooted not because I was bound, but because I chose to remain exactly where she needed me to be.
Chapter 13. The corridor held its breath as we stepped into it, shadows stretching between the dim torches that lined the stone walls like sentries too wise to interrupt. Neither of us had spoken since leaving the terrace, but the silence was not empty, it was dense, pulsing, heavy with the heat we'd been holding back for too long. Each step we took together wound the tension tighter, wrapping it around us like a storm waiting to drop, and I could feel the rhythm of his presence beside me as something more than footsteps. It was gravity. It was the pull I had felt since the first time his hand caught mine in the courtyard and didn't let go. I stopped without warning, placing my palm against the cold wall, not to steady myself, but to halt the forward motion before it broke something open too fast. And I turned to him slowly, deliberately, letting him see what I hadn't said aloud. He stood there, his eyes on mine, and I knew in that moment that neither of us would pretend tonight. He reached for me not quickly, not with hunger, but with a kind of ache that made my breath catch. And when his fingers found my jaw, I didn't close my eyes. I watched him as his thumb brushed the line of my cheek, and I saw the restraint crack in his face before his lips met mine. The kiss didn't ask. It didn't hesitate. It consumed. My back pressed against the stone, but it was his hands that anchored me, one at my hip, the other curled behind my neck, holding me like I was something he'd only just allowed himself to touch. My fingers tangled in his collar, then fisted the front of his shirt, not to pull him closer, because we had already erased every inch between us, but because I needed something to hold while the ground shifted beneath my feet. The heat that flooded my body didn't come in a surge. It rose like tidewater, slow, unstoppable, and deep enough to drown. His mouth moved against mine, like he was making up for every moment we hadn't spoken, every breath we'd spent in silence when we wanted this. His hand moved up my spine, deliberate, reverent, and I arched into the touch without thinking, letting my wolf rise inside me not with urgency, but with permission. She didn't claw forward. She opened like flame drawn toward air. When his lips left mine to trail along my jaw, his breath hot against my skin, I almost forgot where we stood. He whispered something low, almost voiceless, against my neck, and I felt it more than heard it, the sound vibrating through my chest as his hands curved along my waist and lower back, pulling me flush against him like we belonged there. I could feel every line of him, his control barely leashed, his strength not wielded but given. It wasn't dominance. It was surrender in the purest, most dangerous form. And then too soon, too cruelly, everything in him stilled. His hands froze where they rested. His mouth halted, and I felt the shift in the air before I registered the sound behind us. Footsteps, slow, precise. I turned my head, and there he was, hooded, still, a messenger standing just inside the corridor like he had been summoned by the worst kind of fate. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The envelope in his outstretched hands bore the unmistakable seal. Drake. I didn't move for a breath too long, then reached out and took the message, the wax cold against my fingers, and I hated how fast the warmth between us began to retreat beneath the weight of what had interrupted us. I held the letter close to my chest, my lips still tingling, my breath still uneven, and turned back to Oliver, whose hands had not left me but no longer pulled. His gaze was steady, unreadable, but not distant. "Tomorrow," I whispered, voice raw with everything I hadn't finished feeling. "I'll open it tomorrow." He nodded slowly, no protest, no question, just quiet. I didn't step away. I stayed in his arms, and for one last moment, tried to hold on to the heat before it was stolen by what came next. The door to my quarters closed behind us with a soft thud that seemed louder than it should have been, as if the walls themselves understood what we were about to cross into. I didn't light another lantern. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting gold across the stone floor, and the shadows that reached toward us didn't feel cold. They felt necessary. I didn't speak. Neither did he. Words would have broken the thread holding everything taut between us, and right now, it felt like breath alone could undo us. I stepped backward slowly, drawing him in with a glance, not a gesture, and he followed without hesitation, his eyes never leaving mine. There was no question left between us. His hands found my waist, and my back found the wall, but this time there was no restraint in him. No pause, no careful waiting. His mouth found mine like the answer to a question we'd both stopped asking, and when he kissed me this time, it wasn't about permission, it was about need. My hands gripped his shoulders, pulled him closer, and I could feel every part of him pressing against me, real and warm and entirely mine in that moment. My pulse beat so loudly it drowned out everything but the way he touched me, every motion slow, deliberate, reverent, like he was trying to learn what pain hadn't taken from me. His mouth moved along my neck, breath hot against my skin, and when my fingers slipped under the edge of his shirt, he stilled for just a second, forehead against mine, as if asking me to be sure. I didn't need words to answer. I slid my hands higher. The way he inhaled, then shaky, low, almost broken, was more intimate than any confession. And when he lifted me into his arms and carried me toward the bed, I didn't look away. I watched him. I let him see me. He laid me down with care that didn't soften his urgency. And when he joined me, the world outside the firelight ceased to exist. We undressed slowly, without shame or awkwardness, our bodies learning the rhythm that our bond had always known in silence. There was nothing rushed between us, nothing frantic, just heat layered over trust, movement woven with breath, skin met with reverence. He touched me like I was a vow he'd made long before this night, and I answered him with everything I hadn't dared give to anyone else. The space between us vanished not from desire alone, but from recognition. When he entered me, it wasn't fire that broke me open. It was the quiet, the stillness of being held, fully, without fear. Our bodies moved in a rhythm that didn't chase release, it embraced it, shaped it, carried it between us until neither of us remembered where one began and the other ended. I gasped his name once, not loud, but raw, and he pressed his lips to my shoulder, grounding me, holding me together as everything in me cracked and reformed in the space of a heartbeat. We reached the edge together. We fell quietly. No thunder, no noise, just breathe and fire and stillness where once there had only been silence. And when it was over, when the heat began to ease and the only thing left was the way his hand held mine, I didn't look away. I let the weight of the moment settle around us like a second skin. He pulled the blanket over my shoulders, curled beside me without saying a word, and I pressed my back to his chest, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. My eyes stayed open for a long time. I didn't sleep. Not yet, because I knew the letter was still waiting on the mantel, sealed and silent, and whatever lived inside it would find us in the morning. But tonight, in the hush between what was and what would be, I had him. Fully, and for once, I wasn't afraid to stay.